Okay, let's get started. Thank you all for coming to this session. I hope you find something to take away from it, especially when you could be at a much more technical talk at this point in time. But I think that this is a subject that's really important. So let's dive in. I want to start with a question. How many of you would describe software engineering as dangerous? Okay, a couple of you, not many. Now, how many of you would describe an activity that potentially involves hostile relationships, mental and physical stress, and something called a death march? How many of you would describe that as dangerous? Okay, a good number more. Now, what if I told you that software engineering had all those risks and more? Chances are I could probably convince you relatively quick because many of you could probably relate. I've been lucky in that I've gotten to talk with developers all over the world. And what I've found is that many of them describe situations that are not exactly conducive to being a great software engineer. Things like having bad relationships with your managers, or a downright abusive manager, horrendously managed projects with bad expectations and timetables, or even just poor working conditions, right? Not having the right ergonomics for sitting at your desk for hours and hours every day. And that's why I say software engineering is dangerous. It's just not dangerous in the traditional sense that we think. So even when we have good salaries, nice offices, and so on, there's still a lot of risk in the work that we do. There is in every field, in every industry, but the one that we work in, software engineering, software development, is really focused on being creative and innovative and solving difficult problems. But unfortunately, it's not so focused on human interaction, how we relate to each other, and taking care of ourselves. And so this is a combination that easily leads to a lot of stress, and stress can easily lead to physical illness, mental illness, and even burnout if it persists for a long time, which causes people to leave our industry. And that's very unfortunate. So we need a team. We need to not just work by ourselves, but not just any team. We need a specific team, a team that is going to help us turn this risky, dangerous practice into one that's safe for us. And so that's what I want to talk about today. What does that sort of team look like? How do we build an effective, successful team? One that is going to make it so that we can grow and thrive and innovate. What traits should we be looking for in that team? Not just in the team as a whole, but also in ourselves. So my name is Trent Willis. I'm currently a senior UI engineer at Netflix, and I love my job. I've previously worked at companies of various sizes on teams of various sizes, from a couple people to teams that have hundreds of devs, all working on the same project. I've held volunteer positions, leadership positions in those volunteer organizations, and help lead an open source testing framework called QUnit. But in my current role, I really love it because I have lots of freedom. I get to work on interesting problems, and my team is wonderful. And that's probably the primary reason that I really love my job, is because my team is one that I would describe as safe. And it's this really ambiguous idea of a safe team that I want us to explore today. Because most of you, I would challenge, probably don't work in a team that's as safe as it could be. Now you might say, well, what are you talking about? Of course I work in a safe team. It's not like I fear going to work. It's not like I'm in any physical danger while I'm on the office. But that's not the type of safety I'm referring to. I'm referring to safety in a more interpersonal sense. One where you shouldn't fear engaging with your teammates, where you shouldn't fear putting yourself out of your comfort zone if it's going to help your team succeed. You should be in an environment where you feel secure in sharing your opinions, where you feel empowered to challenge the status quo, or at the very least, you should be able to let your manager or your teammates know when you're unhappy about something. Safe teams have been found to decrease illness, they decrease stress, they reduce employee turnover, and they increase productivity for everyone. But as I mentioned earlier, most of us don't work in a team like this. So late last year, the well-known management company Gallup did a survey and released some data that showed that 3 out of every 10 workers, only 3 out of every 10, could strongly agree with the fact that their opinions seem to matter at work. Now that's crazy. That means that 7 out of 10 workers aren't 100% confident that their opinion actually matters in the work that they're doing. And at worst, that means that 7 out of 10 people working with you, 70% of your coworkers, aren't going to speak up, aren't going to share their ideas, and aren't going to actually help you push your company forward. Now, you might be lucky, and maybe you consider yourself one of those 3 in 10 people that feels that your opinion really matters in the workplace. But just because you feel safe doesn't mean that everyone on your team does. And as someone in that position, I would actually say that it's your responsibility to help foster that environment. And in fact, doing so is beneficial for you as well. So Gallup found in that same study that if you could increase the number of people that said that their opinions really mattered at work, that strongly agreed with that statement, to 6 out of 10, you saw tons of benefits. Like you saw a reduction in the number of team members leaving your team. You saw fewer incidents happen. And so if you've ever been on call, that probably sounds pretty good, right? Like fewer teammates leaving and taking that knowledge with them and fewer incidents happening is wonderful. But they also found that you had a 12% increase in productivity. So this sounds like a win across the board to me. But with all this in mind, the question remains, how do we do this? Right? How do we build a safe team? Well, today I have 3 short stories that I'm going to share with you. And hopefully we can get an idea, get a sense from those stories of what a safe team doesn't really look like and how we might actually turn them into one. So at my first job, as a software developer, we practiced code reviews. Now, being a junior developer at the time, my code reviews often had a lot of scrutiny placed on them, which was really fair, and I learned a ton from that process. But unfortunately, these review cycles could take over a day. And that meant if I needed multiple review cycles to actually get all the corrections in, it could take me multiple days to land even tiny changes to our code base. And so after this happened for a while, it got really frustrating. And I started to think that maybe my contributions aren't that valuable to my team because they weren't a priority for anyone else, apparently. So what did I do? Well, I started to contribute less. I worked more slowly. I slacked off. And the end result was no one noticed. So this team for me wasn't safe from a danger of not being sure that the work I was doing was actually meaningful, from feeling worthless. And I'm sure some of you can probably relate, or have had a time in your career where you could relate to that, where it's unclear if the value you are providing to your team is actually real. So in this story, it would be easy to say that the root issue here, the root cause, the root problem we need to focus on is simply that the code review process needs to be better, that you need developers to review code more quickly. And while that's not necessarily wrong, that probably does need to be addressed, I would suggest that it's not the root issue. Oftentimes, when things go wrong with our team, or we have flaws in the way our team functions, we want to point to something easy that we can fix. So what happens is over time, we fix a whole lot of symptoms about how our team is functioning, but we don't address the root causes. And we wind up with a whole lot of complicated processes, complicated rules, complicated guidelines, but the root frustrations about what is actually going on and how the developers feel connected with their work is still there. Like it hasn't actually been solved. But we need to put ourselves in the position of actually dealing with these root frustrations. So there was a time later in my career where we encountered a more widespread issue of slow code reviews at a different company on a very large project. And so we implemented some processes to help fix the problem. We came up with an ideal length of time that a code review should take from like being open to being submitted. And we implemented some bots to help enforce those time limits and made sure that reviews got assigned to people. And so this fixed the speed problem. Code was getting merged faster. But what happened? Well, developers got frustrated, right? People started opening code reviews, and all of a sudden you had something that you had to get to immediately. And it felt, for a lot of folks, like your time was being dictated by the actions of someone else. And that's really frustrating. And it made many developers, especially junior ones, who were a bit unsure in their abilities and probably required a few more review cycles than other folks, feel like they were being a burden to the rest of the team. They were still unsure that they were actually providing value. And in fact, they were getting strong signals that they weren't, that they were annoying other people. And so that root frustration was still there. So the answer here is not more process. It rarely ever is in my experience. But what is the answer then? Well, we need to dig deep and find what the real issue is here. So for situations where we feel like our work isn't providing a lot of value, providing a lot of meaning, there's usually 2 possible root causes, right? The first is probably the obvious one, and that is maybe your contributions aren't actually that valuable. And maybe the team believes that. The second possible root issue is that your team just is bad at giving positive feedback and encouragement. So you never actually see signs of the value that you're providing. And a large part of addressing both of these issues is that we need to carefully communicate with each other. Now, I don't mean care in the sense of sugarcoating or being unnecessarily positive. What I mean is you need to be careful in the sense of being purposeful, being empathetic in the way that you communicate with your teammates. So in that first scenario, maybe your team doesn't actually find your contributions to be that valuable. You should go and talk to that teammate and let them know that the way they're contributing or the way that they're submitting code or whatever is not effective, that there's some way that they need to act to improve that process. Now, don't do it in a condescending or rude way. Approach it as solving a problem, solving a way to make the team better, and not as a personal failure on their part. Seek to find a way to do this without passing judgment on them as a person, which I think is often how we come across. In the second scenario, where contributions are valuable, but your team just doesn't communicate it well, really try to hone in on that in your reviews or any conversation, really. Oftentimes, we approach a lot of what we do as software developers as from a negative perspective, right? We're in meetings to make sure that bad ideas don't get implemented. We do code reviews to make sure that bad code isn't getting into the code base. And so we often fixate on all the negative things that are happening without taking time to really highlight the positive stuff that's happening, right? When you submit a pull request, what is the intention? It's usually positive, right? You're implementing a feature, you're fixing a bug, you're cleaning up some dead code, and so on. So make sure that you actually take time to call those things out. And especially if you're interacting with someone that potentially looks up to you, like a junior developer, it can be tremendously encouraging and empowering for them to know that they are growing and that you have confidence in them. And I would argue that in all cases, we need to be better at giving positive feedback, right? One of the most rewarding experiences I had shortly after joining Netflix was several members of my team came up to me and very candidly said, "Hey, you're doing a great job. Like, you've been killing it ever since you joined." And that was awesome because when you're in a new environment, an unknown environment, you don't necessarily know how you're performing. Like, you may think you're doing well, but compared to the rest of the team, you may not be. Or maybe you think you're doing terribly, but compared to prior standards, like, you're doing excellent. And so that sort of feedback is immensely valuable. This sort of purposeful, empathetic communication is really, really important to building a safe team. You want a team where relationships are strong and where people are meaningfully connected to their work. And so this idea of careful communication that I've talked about is really helped by this practice called mindfulness, which you can define as the practice of paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. Purposeful, non-judgmental attention to what is going on around you is very similar, in theory, to this idea of communicating carefully with each other. And it's, in my experience, a really helpful aspect of building a safe team. So, but as you might gather from the definition I just gave, it's kind of a broad subject. But at its core, it's really just about this simple idea of training yourself to be more cognizant and aware of what's going on around you, both in your personal life as well as in the workplace. And so it's often characterized by things like meditation or yoga and other very structured, very purposeful practices that you might engage in. But yoga and meditation probably sound a bit new agey, right? They're a little unscientific. I'm not sure that that's going to help me be a better developer. But there's been a lot of emerging research recently, as well as an overwhelming amount of anecdotal evidence, that these sorts of things are actually really, really helpful, not just in your personal life, but in your professional life. So as a brief example, the healthcare company Aetna several years ago started offering mindfulness training courses to their employees. After roughly 13,000 employees went through at least one course, they saw some really compelling results. But they found, on average, a 28% reduction in their employees' stress level and a 20% improvement in their reported quality of sleep. And so I don't know about the rest of you, but I could really use less stress in my life and better sleep. And so, in my opinion, that's a really compelling reason for you to at least give this a chance. So the first takeaway that I have for you in this talk today is try out this app called Headspace. It's focused on mindfulness meditation, but it's really easy to get going with. Install the app and the first session takes like 10 minutes. It provides a nice low commitment way to try to start building these practices into your life. Because when you develop mindfulness for your personal life, it actually translates into the way that you interact with your colleagues. It makes it easier to engage with them and to not be judgmental about the stuff that's going on in your life affecting your relationship with them and how you interact with them in the workplace. And so when we apply this to our jobs, it can manifest itself in a variety of different ways, right? If you're reviewing code, stop thinking about all the other stuff that you could be doing or the stress of external factors that you might be bringing in and really pouring out onto this other person that has nothing to do with your problems. Focus on the activity at hand, be positive, and communicate purposefully in that context. Or maybe when you're interacting with your colleagues, you'll start putting away your phone more. Or in meetings, you might close your laptops more and really engage, interact with what is going on. Because that communicates to your teammates that they're valuable, that the stuff that they're talking to you about, that they're interacting with you about, is actually valuable, and it's providing meaning to the team. Now, we've likely all had conversations where the other person seemed really distracted, right? Maybe they kept glancing down to check their phone, or they kept looking away to check their Slack messages. And what it communicates to you is that the stuff that you're talking about isn't really that interesting. It's not that engaging, and it's not valuable. And if they do this all the time, you might start to internalize those feelings. You might start thinking, oh, this thing that I'm talking about isn't valuable. And instead it becomes, I'm not valuable to this person. I'm not important to this person. And that's really dangerous if you're trying to build a cohesive team that can collaborate on hard problems. So make sure you show interest. It's really not that hard. And it does a tremendous thing when you're working on a team that needs to creatively solve problems. Now we can take these ideas and extend them beyond just our immediate workplace though, right? It also applies to open source software. So it's no secret that the open source software community is unwelcoming in several ways. It has its share of issues, right? When new contributors try to join, there's a bunch of weird hurdles that they have to get over. Reviews might come across as angry or unwelcoming and unfriendly. And then once a contributor actually makes it over those hurdles, they're bombarded by unreasonable demands from users or harsh feedback about the software that they're open sourcing for free for people. And so this frequently leads to people burning out. And then on their way out, they're just like, I'm done with this. I'm going to write a nasty blog post and tweet about it and then never come back. But if we apply some mindfulness, some care into the communication that we employ in open source, things might look a little bit different. Right? When new contributors try to join, we would be purposeful and encouraging in our initial interactions. And in fact, GitHub has even implemented some features to help highlight when someone is new so that we can do this. Or as users, we might not let the pressures from our jobs influence how we interact with these people whose software we're using for free. Or when we hit the point of quitting, we might actually take time to step back and offer constructive criticism rather than writing an angry post or an article in that moment. Right? Take some time to reflect. Be purposeful, practice empathy. And if we apply these lessons to all realms of software development, I think we'll actually see a lot more people feeling included and welcome and stepping up and innovating in ways that we haven't seen before. Instead of this environment that we currently have where a lot of people are really kind of afraid, insecure in what they're doing. So fear in particular, I think is actually the most compelling reason for us to pursue this idea of a safe team. Because fear is ultimately the enemy of innovation that we have. Which brings me to my next story. So in my second job, I got to work on an important piece of infrastructure for a really large application. Now, I was still relatively junior at the time, so I made sure that I got feedback from other developers before doing anything. I went and talked with senior engineers across the company, even presented it to a couple design committees. They all signed off on it. And so I was really proud of the work that I did. Right? These people I respected had said, like, hey, this is solid. Let's move forward with this. But when performance review time came around, it was a different story. There were some problems with the project, and they were ultimately used as justification to not give me a promotion. Now, not getting a promotion was obviously a huge bummer, but the real frustrating part was that they left comments saying that I had acted too independently, that I should have involved more senior developers, even though that's what I thought that I did. So what happened? Well, I started to avoid responsibility in the future. I didn't want to take responsibility for any team decision or what I thought was a team decision if all of the blame was going to fall back onto me and going to affect my ability to move up in my career. So eventually, due to that and some other issues, I left the organization entirely. Now, just as before, it would be really easy for us to find a solution to this problem and say, oh, you should have been promoted. Or maybe take the other viewpoint and say, are you sure you actually deserve that promotion? But I would argue that the whole aspect of promotion, not getting a promotion, raise, whatever, is really just a distraction. The real issue here is that the reality of the work that I had done didn't seem to get properly communicated to the people that were making decisions, right? There was this disconnect between how I had gone about pursuing this feature and the reality of what had been communicated to the people that eventually made decisions about that work. And so this let me know that this team, it wasn't safe for me. It wasn't safe for me to take risks, and I needed to be really careful about the work that I decided to pursue, because if it didn't go according to plan, I would probably be stuck at where I was. And so this problem is known as impression management, right? It's this idea that you have to act a certain way, only engage in certain activities in your workplace, to make sure that you have a favorable perception of yourself amongst other people. Basically, you need to manipulate others to make sure that you feel safe and comfortable in your job. And you see this all the time in teams, right? Where maybe you avoid asking questions because you don't want to look stupid. Or you never own up to your mistakes because you're afraid you might get punished. Or you never criticize the status quo because that might hurt your chances of getting a promotion. These behaviors are really poison to building good teams that can innovate and move things forward in compelling new ways. Because everyone's more worried about the impression that they're going to leave than they are about the work that they're doing. And that's really what's wrong at the heart of the story that I just shared. I wasn't willing to take risks any longer. I wasn't willing to be responsible because I was worried about the impression it was going to leave on this distant committee that I never really interacted with. I felt that I could only accept responsibility for things that I knew were going to go well. And so this sort of fear leads teams to stagnate and potentially even completely fall apart if it gets bad enough. And it does this in much the same way that tech debt does. Right? When you have lots of tech debt in your problem, it becomes difficult, or in some cases, impossible for you to actually make changes and make progress or deliver new features. No one wants to risk those sorts of changes because you're not sure how it's going to affect your project as a whole, or maybe even impact the rest of your business. So in the very same way, if your team is built on this culture of impression management, a fear of sharing your ideas, it becomes difficult and in some cases impossible for you to enact any sort of lasting change to your team's culture, implement new and novel ideas, pursue stuff that might be a little bit risky. Because I don't want to propose an idea that's going to blow back on me, right? And you probably don't want to say something that might make you look foolish. So how do we combat this type of culture, right? Well, I'm reminded of a story actually about my mom from when I was younger. I'm a very risk-averse person by nature, and so I tend not to break rules. But I can distinctly remember a time when I was about 5 years old, and I had accidentally broken a pair of scissors. Now, I knew that breaking things was wrong, but I was also 5, so I couldn't cover it up very well. And my mom found out, and without even really confronting me, she basically just looked at me, and I broke down in tears. Now, being a good mother at the time, she was very comforting and very understanding. What really stood out to me, though, about that interaction is she let me know that she understood it was an accident. Accidents happen. She wasn't blaming me for it. And instead, we just corrected the issue and moved forward. So in much the same way, we need our teams to acknowledge that accidents happen. We are not going to be perfect developers all the time. And if you have a fear that you have to be perfect all the time, then it's only going to lead you to not do anything actually noteworthy with the time that you spend working. And so this type of environment, one where you can take risks, is known as a psychologically safe environment. And so psychological safety is this idea that you should feel comfortable taking interpersonal risks within your team, or really any group of people. Interpersonal risks are things like suggesting a new, potentially controversial way to solve a problem, or owning up to a failure in front of your teammates and actually learning from it. They're risks because they put you in a position where you could potentially be embarrassed, or maybe even downright punished for your actions. So you could define psychological safety as being able to really show up and employ yourself in your work without fear of negative consequences to your self-image, to your status, or to your career. Or to put that more plainly, you should have a sense of confidence that your team isn't going to reject, to embarrass, or punish you for actually speaking up. These sorts of teams give everyone a chance to contribute to discussions, and they're cognizant of how their interactions actually affect each other. And they work together to overcome those. This stands in contrast to the team that I described earlier, where the culture is built on fear. Fear of their impression that they're leaving, and fear of any ideas that they might be sharing. So I work at Netflix, and we have a very well-defined company culture. We've shared a document publicly for years, and I would encourage you to go check it out if you have time. It's a really interesting read. But in this document, we list 10 key values as part of our culture. And with each value, we provide some examples of what it means, how we exemplify it. And so one of them is courage. And I find that it ties in remarkably well with this idea of psychologically safe teams and taking risks. And so here are 3 examples that they give as to what it means to be courageous. You take smart risks and are open to possible failure. You say what you think when it's in the best interest of Netflix, even if it is uncomfortable. And you are willing to be critical of the status quo. These ideas that are so baked into our company culture help us innovate. And they help us keep a company culture where we're not scared of failure. We can take smart risks and bet on new things. Now, it's all well and good to say that we should be open to failure, but how do you actually respond when failure happens, right? How do you respond in a way that isn't going to scare people off in the future? The short answer, in my opinion, is simply experiment and learn rapidly. And I like to think about this in terms of continuous deployments, right? If you have an effective continuous deployment setup for your web app, or any software really, then the impact of a single bad commit is usually small. If a bad commit goes out, you get quick feedback, you make corrections, and you do a new release. You move forward. In a similar fashion, if you have a large issue that happens, you pretty much follow the same steps, but then maybe you follow up with a postmortem or some other retrospective afterwards to make further long-standing corrections. So we can apply this to how we interact with one another, right? If someone makes a mistake, don't just forget about it. Go and give them feedback. Help them make corrections. Move forward. Don't dwell on that feedback. Don't sit on it until later, as many companies often do. Right? You have an annual performance review time. And so a lot of people will just hold that feedback until that performance review cycle comes around. And what does that do? It creates a culture where all you're doing is scorekeeping. Right? You're saving it up for this predestined time. And people can't actually make changes until that happens. And this sort of scorekeeping is really just another type of fear that you can have in your team. And it's really bad. Now, if a major mistake happens, which is bound to happen every now and then, do the same thing. Give candid, timely feedback. Let people know that the mistake has been made. But also move forward. If you need to pursue further actions to deal with the fallout of whatever mistake was made, make sure you let them know that up front. Don't wait on it and don't surprise them with it. In the story that I shared, it would have been really nice if someone had come to me and said, hey, it looks like this project is having some problems. We should probably work on addressing those. And just so you know, this might affect your promotion in the future. That would have been a lot more helpful in understanding, in my opinion, than finding out later, hey, yeah, there were problems, and because of that, we're not going to promote you. It would have been nice to have had a chance to correct it. So one model for thinking about this actually comes from the Air Force, and it's called the OODA loop, which stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, and Act. It was originally developed for combat scenarios in jet planes, but you can apply it to a lot of other decision-making processes. So the basic idea is that given a set of observations and some feedback, you can actually orient them in your current context, apply what's going on around you, make a decision from that information, and then act on it. And whatever feedback you get from that action, you can then feed back into the beginning and do it all again. The actual model for this, however, is slightly more complex and looks like this. Now, the premise of it seems really logical, right? But we often skip portions of this model. We make observations, and then maybe we jump straight into acting without actually thinking about how we should apply the solution in our exact context. I think we do this a lot with technology choices. Or maybe we do everything right, but we don't actually formulate a way to test, to get feedback of the results of our actions. And so we don't actually get feedback, and thus we don't actually have a loop. And so the important feature of this model for experimenting and learning rapidly is actually feedback. In fact, it's so important that it happens 3 different times on this chart. Feedback is really critical. We don't learn without feedback. And in fact, it's so important that Netflix has an entire paragraph about it in our culture memo. And since it's worded so well there, I'm just going to read it to you. So it says, we believe we will learn faster and be better if we can make giving and receiving feedback less stressful and more a normal part of our work life. Feedback is a continuous part of how we communicate and work with one another versus an occasional formal exercise. We build trust by being selfless in giving feedback to our colleagues, even if it is uncomfortable to do so. Feedback helps us to avoid sustained misunderstandings and the need for rules. Feedback is more easily exchanged if there's a strong underlying relationship and trust between people, which is part of why we invest time in developing these professional relationships. We celebrate the people who are very candid, especially to those in more powerful positions. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, but we can summarize it by simply saying that feedback helps us build trust, it helps us avoid additional process and burdens, and develops better working relationship amongst the people that we work with. And when we take feedback and we start to let it inform our future decisions and how we act, it really helps us improve, not just as an individual, but as a company and as a team. So give feedback, learn rapidly from your failures, and try to be courageous when you're building a workplace where your team feels safe to take risks. Now, one remaining portion of this is how do we actually find the feedback that we want to give to someone? Right? If you give bad feedback to someone, it's actually, in my opinion, probably worse than not giving them any feedback. And so I'm a big fan of this model called the 5 whys. And it's pretty simple, and it helps you find good feedback to give people. The idea is really simple. When presented with a problem, you repeatedly ask the question why until you get to a root issue instead of a superficial one. And it's called, the number 5 clearly comes from the fact that anecdotally 5 seems to be about the right number of times to ask. And so as an example, let's consider the scenario where I push some bad code to production. Right? The conversation might go a bit like this. Why is production broken? Well, Trent pushed some bad code. Why was Trent able to push bad code? Well, we didn't have tests for that code. Why didn't we have tests for that code? Well, we needed to ship to hit the deadline. Why didn't the deadline include time to actually write those tests? We didn't include them in the estimate. Why didn't we include them in the estimate? We don't consider tests to be part of a feature. And there you have it. The root issue is that we need to revamp how we estimate and scope a feature that we're adding. Tests need to be included because we consider them an important part of delivering a feature. And so this 5 whys approach helps people feel confident that they're not going to just get blamed for mistakes, because you find these deep issues, these deep misunderstandings and problems that you need to fix. Mistakes get treated as gaps in your tooling or your techniques or your training, and not necessarily as a personal failure, which makes it safe for people to take smart risks. So there are 2 quotes that I think really hammer home this point. The first is, never place a worker only one defense away from failure. And I think the real big reason why that is because people aren't really afraid of failure. They're afraid of blame, right? Most of us are pretty comfortable taking risks so long as we know that should they not work out as planned, our team is going to have our back. So psychological safety is really important if we want to innovate and avoid stagnation. And it also helps us grow. But there's one other major benefit specific to software engineering, I think, and that is it lets us take risks with the technology that we use. Unlike many other fields, ours changes ridiculously fast. I myself work in the front end, primarily with JavaScript, and so I've seen firsthand that you have to be willing to take risks, adopt new things early if you want to be on the cutting edge and attract top talent and have a work culture that people actually want to work in. So developing a safe team makes it easier for you to do these sorts of things. It makes it easier for you to adopt new frameworks, to try out new languages, and adapt to this ever-shifting world of development best practices, like we see at conferences like this. And those aspects are really just focused on keeping up. If you're in a position where you actually want to innovate, to push the industry forward, then you're going to need to take even bigger risks. Go into uncharted territory where no one else has been before, and potentially the only people you'll have with you are those on your team. Now, if you're not in a safe team, when you do these sorts of things, they're likely either A, never going to get off the ground, or B, they're going to get off the ground, but then you're going to burn out quickly because you don't feel you can rely on your team. Which brings us to my final story. So I was in a role where I got to work more or less independently at this point. I had a senior title and a very proven track record of delivering solid features. I was a good developer. And it seemed like a really great role. I got to work on interesting stuff. I got to work independently. But I found that I quickly became pretty unhappy with it. I wasn't getting to work closely with others, which meant that I wasn't getting good feedback. I couldn't tell if I was growing. I couldn't tell if the work I was delivering was actually to the quality that it needed to be. And I had no one to bounce ideas off of. And more importantly, no one to discuss my work life with. So as work started to pile up, as happens from time to time, there was no one I could really talk to about it, which sucks because as a software developer, I like to complain about things. So eventually I started to feel burnout and I wanted to quit. Now, I get that it's the dream of many developers to get to work independently and on projects that interest you and to be self-directed. But honestly, that independence can very quickly start to feel like isolation if you don't have a strong support system in place. And when work begins to pile up, you're going to feel like you're shouldering this humongous burden on your own. And you can't just shrug it off. Because there's this really unfortunate vicious cycle that engages for a lot of developers, right? We feel that we have too much work, and we feel it's this amount of work that's causing the problem. So what do? Well, we work more, we work harder to try to pay down that amount. And the result is we just add more stress. And oftentimes the cycle will continue very slowly over time until we finally hit a point where we can't take it anymore, and we burn out and we crash. Or we're lucky and we have someone close to us point it out and say, hey, this isn't healthy, and helps us course correct. So the issue in my original story here isn't that I was working independently or didn't have a team. The issue was that there wasn't support system in place. There wasn't transparency into what was going on. There was not enough communication between myself and the other team members. Now, before we venture into really talking about how to prevent this sort of thing, I want to take a moment to really highlight what burnout and work fatigue mean for software engineers. Because we talk about them a lot. And I'm afraid these terms have started to lose their meanings for a lot of folks. So let's start by talking about what burnout is not. Burnout is not just a single event. It's more like a process. It's not feeling tired from a long weekend or having a single off day. And it's not even needing a vacation. Right? And it's definitely not just an excuse that people throw around. Though I will grant you, some developers do use it in that way. Burnout is a state of chronic stress. It's a real thing. And it leads us to feel physically and emotionally exhausted. And it can start to make you feel cynical and detached, not just about your work, though that is where it'll start. It can make you feel detached from everything going on in your life. And it'll make you feel ineffective and unaccomplished, despite any evidence that you might see around you, any evidence to the contrary. And so as Zach Coleman once put it, burnout is really sneaky. It doesn't usually announce itself. It slowly grinds at you until those feelings become the new normal. And at that point, it's not easy to recognize, and it's not easy to dig yourself out of it. So as software developers, we're very susceptible to this sort of ailment for several contributing factors. First, we're hyper-connected. It's easier for us to stay connected to our work than most other professions. And since we're involved in a creative pursuit, we often feel a personal attachment or creative attachment to the work that we produce, maybe even an obligation to it. And many of us are very passionate about writing code. And so we do it in our spare time. And plus, as I mentioned earlier, our field is constantly evolving, which puts tremendous pressure on you to keep up. So what do? How do we combat this? Well, I actually believe the answer from a team perspective is a combination of the two things that we were talking about before: psychological safety and mindfulness. I've seen that these two can actually come together in the workplace to create a virtuous cycle that helps us combat these issues. Mindfulness helps us be in a state where we can foster psychological safety for our team. And being in a team like that actually gives us space to be mindful of what's going on around us and develop mindfulness in our own life. Now, that idea might be a bit abstract. So I want to share two practical things that you can try out to see this in action in your team. If you're leading a meeting, encourage everyone to actually contribute and track it. Write down their names as they speak. This accomplishes several things. First, it helps you build a safe team because everyone feels encouraged to contribute and they know that their opinion is actually wanted and desired in those discussions. And that actually forces you to be present, to be engaged or mindful of what is going on in your meeting and with your teammates, because you have to keep track of it. And as an added bonus, it'll help you realize if there are people in your meeting that don't need to be there. And as software engineers, I'm sure all of us have been to meetings where we wish we weren't invited. So another idea that can be employed in any group conversation, not necessarily meetings specifically, but maybe even in just a group chat next to a whiteboard as you're working through a problem, is to simply review, repeat, and acknowledge people's contributions to discussions. This doesn't mean repeat what they said word for word, or try to act like you knew what they were going to say ahead of time, but actually acknowledge what they said, incorporate aspects of it into your response to people. Something like maybe, hey, I really liked what Sue said about X. How can we incorporate that into this? Or that's an interesting point about Y. Can you elaborate on what you meant by that? Or Joe had a really good point about Z. We should make sure we keep that in mind as we move forward. And the idea here is to actually acknowledge and ascribe value to the people that are contributing to your discussions. Right? Too often, in particular with technical discussions, we simply want to build on what each other are saying. We jump from one point to the next without ever stopping to really acknowledge and give meaning to the contributions that people are making. Now, obviously, don't go overboard with this or else it's going to sound really weird with people just like saying their names back and forth with each other. But these sorts of little tweaks go a really long way and have a very profound impact for developing a team where everyone feels that they're actually contributing, providing meaningful value to your team. So in addition to these little tweaks with how we interact with one another, we should also take stock of our own self, work on our intrapersonal development as well as our interpersonal development. So to that end, let's talk about fitness. Now don't worry, not physical fitness, but emotional fitness. So Dr. Emily Anhalt is a psychologist that works in the Silicon Valley area. She works with tech companies like GitHub. And she talks often about this idea of emotional fitness, which I think is really great because it takes the topic of emotional health, which seems a bit weird or abstract to most of us, and puts it in terms that we can start to think about. Physical fitness. What comes to mind? Well, you need to work out, you need to eat healthy, you need to try to avoid some stress, and so on. You can't just do nothing and expect to be physically fit. Right? Similarly, you can't just do nothing and expect to be emotionally fit. In a similar vein, we know that just because someone isn't obviously sick or ill doesn't mean that they're necessarily healthy or living a healthy lifestyle. And so when we think about emotional health, you don't have to be suffering from depression or bipolar disorder or some other major mental health issue to be emotionally unhealthy. Just because you're not ill doesn't mean you're healthy. So think about the last time you got stressed out, right? Did you react poorly to others or did you handle it in a way that you're proud of? Or when life threw you a curveball, how did you react to others? Did you handle it in a way that you're proud of? Or maybe did you go on a week-long bender? These sorts of things are what we should think about when we're evaluating ourselves, trying to find out if we're reacting and relating to our coworkers in a positive way. But how do we actually work on this, right? Like, how do you become emotionally fit? Well, Dr. Anhalt has given some excellent talks on this subject, and I'll be tweeting about them later if you're interested. But for now, there's one simple thing that you can do, really, and that is set aside a couple hours each week to play. And what I mean by play is to engage in something purely for enjoyment rather than any practical purpose. And for many of us, I bet this means that you need to put away your laptop, turn off the TV, and put away your cell phone. Because too often it's really easy for us to get sucked into this void of feeling like we have to be doing something beneficial, working on our career, or focusing on development if we're in front of a screen. Right? I often find myself like working on open source stuff that I don't really want to be working on just because I feel obligated to it. Or maybe I find myself scrolling through Twitter, not because I'm actually interested, but because I want to make sure I'm not falling behind on JavaScript news. And that's really unhealthy. We need to find ways to truly relax. And that's why I say, find a way to play and not necessarily just relax. So I really like this quote from Niall Horan, who's actually a singer, a member of the boy band One Direction. But when asked in an interview about why he enjoyed playing the guitar, he said, someone once told me the smile on my face gets bigger when I play the guitar. And so my question to you all is, what makes you smile more? Find that and do it, or at least a couple hours each week. I can guarantee your overall quality of life will improve. So if we want to be emotionally fit, we need to understand it's an ongoing commitment, just like to our physical health. We have to look inward, we have to evaluate ourselves, and become more self-aware. And this is going to help us build a work culture where other people are comfortable around us and where we can relate to people in meaningful and work-appropriate ways. So a large part of Netflix's culture is centered on high performance and delivering results. And we're very upfront about firing people, which can be really scary. And honestly, almost feels at odds with this idea of a safe work environment that I've been talking about. And as I considered joining the company, it was probably my biggest reservation. I was good at my current job, and I was worried that this new job was going to have a lot of stress and make me feel like an imposter and out of place. But after talking with my would-be manager and my would-be teammates quite a bit, they won me over and I decided to join. And any fears that I had were quickly dismissed within the first couple weeks of joining for two primary reasons from my manager. The first is that one of my initial interactions with my manager was him coming up to me at the end of one of my first days and saying, "Hey, you've been here 8 hours, you should go home." It was a super intentional act, right? He didn't have to tell me to go home. He could have let me stay and keep working. But it showed through both his words and his action that he actually valued me having a work-life balance. I wasn't expected to work long hours, and just because I put in more time didn't mean that I was going to be a high performer or deliver better results. It was safe for me to go home at a reasonable time. The second example came a couple days later when my manager didn't come into the office at all. He actually sent an email to the team and said, "I won't be coming in, I'm taking a mental health day." And that was profound. It was a much bigger act, but it let us know, like, hey, if something's going on in our life, we can actually take time off to deal with it. We're not beholden to work all the time, 24/7. And I think what you'll find is that policies like this, they tremendously benefit your company, and very few people are going to abuse them. And if they do, you just deal with those cases. So my point is that we need to take breaks, we need to take care of ourselves. And if you're in a position of leadership or just someone that others look up to, model the behavior that you want other people to do, to follow. Set an example. Now I realize most of us can't just take days off whenever we want, but most of us could be a lot better about setting boundaries around work, right? Don't respond to email late at night, or honestly, don't respond to email once you've left the office. Don't check Slack after hours. Set boundaries. You don't have to be accessible to your work 24/7. I think doing these things, which are honestly pretty small changes, are going to go a long way towards combating burnout in our industry. We work in a very creative, a very exciting field, and it has tons of rewarding opportunities. But I thoroughly believe that as software becomes a more and more important part of society, and as the need and demand for software developers grows, working conditions for us are not going to get better magically. In fact, I think that they'll get much worse for a lot of folks. Because many of our ideas about how to scale businesses aren't centered on creative problem solving and being innovative or fostering psychological and physical safety. They're actually focused on doing things repeatedly, implementing more process so you can get the same results time and time again. And that is largely antithetical to this idea of being creative, being innovative, solving new and unique problems. So we have to respond to this by building safe teams, by being really intentional about the type of culture we want to develop. And so to end, I want to share some additional studies that have been done in this area to really convince you that this is super important to your business and to your team and to yourself. So Dr. Amy Edmondson is a professor at Harvard Business School, and she found in her research that psychological safety in teams is actually one of the strongest predictors of increases in the team's quality, increases in their learning behavior, and improvements in their overall performance. And an internal study of Google, which was done over several years and across several hundred of their teams, found similar results. So psychological safety is tremendously important if you want to thrive and build great products. Similarly, the American Psychological Association, or APA, has found that mindfulness can help us reduce our emotional exhaustion and improve our job satisfaction. So mindfulness is also important if we want a healthy work-life balance and to avoid burnout and to be better teammates to each other. So in this talk, we've looked at personal examples, some studies, I've shared a few tips, all around safe teams. And I hope that you walk out of here excited about this idea of making your team safe or trying out some of these ideas. But under all these thoughts that I've shared, really my strongest motivating factor is just that we need to focus on making people awesome. People like myself, people like you, people like everyone else that we work with, we all have the ability to be great, to be awesome at what we do in our jobs if we're put in the right environment to grow and to thrive. Now, it's my belief that for the vast majority of people, that environment is one of safety, one where they can take smart risks confidently, where they know that their contributions they're making are really valuable and are encouraged to focus on both their physical health and their mental health in addition to the development of their career. So if we want to make people awesome, then it's really only reasonable, in my opinion, that we make safety a requirement. In the same way that we make tests a requirement for our software so that we can confidently grow our product and ship new features, we should make safety a requirement for our teams so that we can confidently grow our people. So I've mentioned Netflix's culture memo a couple times in this talk. And it concludes with a quote that says, if you want to build a ship, don't drum up the people to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. Similarly, I would say if you want to build a great team, don't drum up people to just share their feelings or conduct a bunch of trainings and implement new processes. Instead, teach them, we need to teach ourselves to yearn for the vast and untapped potential of everyone that's around us. Thank you. So if you have any questions or comments, come chat with me right after this. I'd love to chat with you, I really would. And if you have any follow-up questions later on, you can message me on Twitter, where I'll also be tweeting a link to these slides shortly.